So hi again, everyone. Hope you've been enjoying all the talks as much as I have. And as Evgeny said, I'm Kevin from CodeMagic. And as you might know, we really love Flutter and helping the community build their Flutter apps. Personally, I help people setting up CI/CD pipelines. And as part of that task, I use YAML config files. And I wanted to share some tips that I've learned about making this more efficient. My personal experience is that I've been working with CodeMagic for 6 months, and I've really had to get up to speed with how to use YAML files more efficiently to make the pipelines work well. So even though I'm talking in the context of CI/CD, this talk should really be useful for anybody who comes across YAML or uses it. So it could be that you're working with something like Docker, which uses a YAML-based config. So today I'm presenting Killing YAML Boilerplate, or DRY, Don't Repeat Your YAML. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with YAML through using the pubspec.yaml in your Flutter projects. Just when it comes to a CI/CD environment, it gets a little bit more complicated if you're not already a DevOps specialist. But before I get started on that, I just wanted to tell you that today is a very special day for CodeMagic. It's actually our birthday, and we're actually 2 years old today. We launched CodeMagic alongside Google at the Flutter Live 2018 conference on December the 4th. So there's quite a few celebrations going on at the CodeMagic headquarters today. And just a few fun facts about what's happened in 2 years. We've helped around 39,000 developers with their app builds. We've grown our Slack community that talks about using CodeMagic for building apps to about 3,000 participants. And so far, we've run about 600,000 builds on the CodeMagic service. So I just thought I'd put that in there because we're quite happy that we've made it to our 2nd birthday. Okay, so back to the main event. What I'm going to be covering in the next 20 minutes or so will be what is YAML and why it's good to use in CI/CD. I'll be talking about using workflows with Flutter flavors. I'll be discussing YAML validation. I'll be talking about how to reduce the amount of repetition you're making in your YAML files using aliases, anchors, and mappings. And then I'll float some ideas about how you can keep consistent with using YAML templates. So what is YAML and why should we use it in CI/CD? So it's a declarative manifest that's commonly used for configuration files and in applications where data is stored and transmitted. The YAML.org website says that YAML is a human-friendly data serialization standard for all programming languages. And personally, I've encountered it using Docker, ejabberd, and more recently in Flutter, especially with the pubspec.yaml. And as I said, since I started with CodeMagic, I've been using YAML nearly every day. And it's something that you can use with a lot of different CI/CD systems, not just CodeMagic. So when I was preparing this presentation, I looked up the meaning of YAML, and I came across, I always thought it meant yet another markup language. So it's actually funny that they did want to use that as the acronym to begin with, but they thought that it's a bit more than markup, and they changed the acronym to mean YAML ain't markup language, which is actually a recursive acronym. So I thought that was kind of interesting. YAML was actually proposed in 2001, so it's already about 19 years old, almost 20. And it's actually a superset of JSON. Another interesting thing I found, the YAML website said that even though a lot of people are using .yml as the file extension, please use .yaml. So I found that quite interesting. And the final one, probably a bit controversial. The YAML standard actually forbids the use of tabs, and actually you should be using spaces. Hopefully they won't find out that I've been using tabs and get me in trouble, so please don't tell anyone. So there's some of the fun facts, but why is it important to use YAML in CI/CD? I think one of the main things I've found is that it gives you a lot more flexibility and control over your build process, especially when you're adding build scripts within your pipelines. You can integrate easier with third-party services, and I usually integrate with things like AWS Device Farm, Firebase App Distribution, or something like SonarQube. Working with YAML files also allows you to check your pipelines into version control and keep track of changes. So you're not in any danger of somebody logging into a UI-based system and making changes and not understanding why something's broken. And that's especially important if you're working in a team, so you can keep track of changes as they happen. Also, it's probably a good thing to know about YAML because you might not necessarily know how a specific product works, but YAML's a common standard, so it's good to get familiar with it and learn how it works. Oh, sorry. Another thing is that it means you're not vendor locked in. So if you're using a system that's using YAML, then you can transfer your build scripts from one service provider to another if you ever need to change in the future. One of the biggest problems that I've found in using YAML is the fact that you have to be very consistent with your indentation. If you get it slightly wrong, it just won't work. So I've found a few tools to help with getting the syntax and the indentation correctly. The first one that I came across was the online YAMLlint.com. So what I would typically do, if I can just find a browser window, is I would go to, let's bring one up here, to their website, YAMLlint.com. And then I would take something like the pubspec.yaml, copy that, and then paste it into the validation tool, click go. One of the things I found though was it was stripping out the comments and actually renaming the properties. So if you thought you could just copy paste that back into the original document, then you might find it looking completely different. However, it does work very well in terms of if you make some incorrect indentation and try to revalidate the file, it will actually point out which line your error is occurring on. So it is a useful tool. The interesting thing is that you can actually install YAMLlint locally as well. So in my IDE, I'm using VS Code. I actually installed YAMLlint on my Mac using Brew, and you can actually just type in the command YAMLlint and then do pubspec.yaml, and then it should run the validation against the file. So here you can see that YAMLlint doesn't particularly like files which are too long. So these comments are quite long lines, and it tells you which line that it thinks is a problem. But you can actually ignore those long errors there, long line errors. But if we put a extra indentation here, for example, and then run the command again, it should then come up with additional errors in there, telling us that the comments aren't indented correctly. So it's quite useful. What you'll probably also see here, another tool that I'm particularly fond of is I looked in the marketplace for Visual Studio Code, and I did a search for YAML, and it's perhaps the first result that comes up is YAML language support. And what this actually does is it will validate your files in real time. And then let's just go to a different file here, for example, go to CodeMagic over here. And if I start messing around with the indentation, it will start coming up with red squiggly lines to indicate that we've got bad indentation. So that's very, very useful. So up until very recently, this is the main way I've been validating my files. In the last week or so, though, over at CodeMagic, we've made it so when you upload a YAML file for your pipeline, it will actually come up with a message in the interface. So you can see here it says we've got an invalid configuration for your YAML, and it will tell you which lines that you need to look at before you can actually proceed with running a build. So there's just a few suggestions of actually how you can validate your YAML files. Okay, so next thing I wanted to look at was how to make it more efficient to use or build your Flutter flavors with workflows. So normally, let's have a look at a workflow. And this is all sort of my personal sort of ideas and opinions. There's nothing wrong with what I'm showing now. So somebody building a flavor would probably normally set up a workflow for each flavor. So in this YAML document here, if we just make it a little bit bigger so you can all see it well, I have a workflow set up for a dev flavor of an iOS project. And also I've got a prod version of my app set up as well. And what people would tend to do normally is in the build commands. So here we've got a Flutter build iOS, but passing in the flavor dev. So it's hard coded. And then that will generate or update the Xcode project. And then when we run our command here to build an IPA, we would again be hard coding in the scheme and the config information. And that would be repeated again in the prod version here. So you see down here, I've got it hard coded. So what we've seen people do is use environment variables and override these values by triggering a build using the API. So what will happen is we'll use the environment variable for Xcode scheme and Xcode config, override this value that's set to X, and then we've only got one workflow that I've now called iOS flavors instead of the prod and the pub version. And then if we look further down in the file, you can see that instead of hard coding the value, I'm now passing in the flavor as the environment variable Xcode scheme. And then when I run the build of the IPA, I'm passing in Xcode scheme and Xcode config. Now, to get those values to the workflow, I would need to call the API. So, for example, this would be how we would do that. So I could run a curl request, pass in my XAuth token, and then I would provide a JSON object, tell it which app I'm building, but most importantly, there's this section here that will pass in environment variables. So this one passes in the scheme name of dev and the config of release dev. And just by running that command, we'll trigger the build and then make sure it's producing that flavor. I've also set one up for the prod version where the variables are set to prod and to release prod. Now, some of our customers have taken this to an even more advanced level where they are working with a lot of white labeled apps, hundreds of them, and they'll actually pass in a specific app ID and they will actually get their assets for the flavor from a database in the build scripts. So they can then add the correct images and whatever else they need and icons to that app. So that's just a thought of how we can improve our workflow in the YAML when it comes to using Flutter flavors. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was how to use YAML aliases, anchors, and mappings to make things a little bit more efficient as well. So anchors are a way of repeating your code later on in your YAML file, and they are normally represented with an ampersand character. And as you can see on the right-hand side here, I've got one called get Flutter packages, which I've prefixed with an ampersand. And beneath that, there's a script which will run Flutter packages pub get. Then later in the workflow, when I want to call that script, I will use the alias, which is represented by an asterisk, and it calls that get Flutter packages. And then when you define multiple scripts, you can then run the aliases and call them. So typically what we will do is set up a definitions area where we have all of our anchors, and then we'll have a workflow which will then use these aliases. I'll show you a real world example in just a moment. But before that, let's just discuss mappings. So mappings allow you to take a dictionary of items. So in this case, on the right-hand side, we've got env_versions, and this will define my environment that I'm going to be using for building. So we've got Flutter stable, Xcode 12.1, and CocoaPods default. And then at the bottom, we use this double less than symbol followed by a colon, and then an alias of n versions to expand this map into the environment section. And again, that would be defined in the definition section so it can be reused. So let's have a look at what we would normally have and how we could actually improve it. So if we go over here to what I've called CodeMagic Standard. So this file is pretty long. So if we just have a look at what we've got, we would have a workflow for my iOS release. I'm telling it things such as how many minutes I want it to build for, the environment variables. I've got some encrypted values that we can use for connecting to the App Store. These are typically things like private keys and identifiers. I've got my triggering section, and then I have a section for my scripts that are actually used for building. So things like getting the Flutter packages, incrementing the build number of your Xcode projects, installing CocoaPods, fetching signing files. Okay, so each time we define a new workflow, and you'll see that this is probably, I don't know, 100 lines or so long. Yeah, for that one. What we'll do is if we have another workflow for develop, typically what we'll see is it's got the similar kinds of values, because you might want to be publishing that to the App Store Connect Test Flight service, but using the same environment variables. So you're repeating things unnecessarily. And then if you add more workflows for Android develop and Android release, by the time you expand out all these, you've probably got a few hundred lines of code in your file and a lot of repetition. But if we look at how we can improve this, let's go to this CodeMagic file here. What we've done is we've set up an area called definitions, and you're going to start seeing a lot of these anchors in the code, where this one will let us define our environment or automatic iOS signing values. This one's going to be for my environment variables. This one's letting me define different artifacts. So this one will be picking up the IPA file once it's built, or the APK file for an Android project. I've also got a section here for the different scripts that I'm going to be running. So these are all the build steps that we looked at previously. So we've made our anchors, but to use them, we can then just minimize that section, use it in our workflow, and you'll see that I'm starting to use mappings. And then here's my environment one, where I've got my iOS signing credentials and the environment. And then from here, I've got all the aliases for the scripts. So you can pick and choose from your set of definitions which scripts you want to run in which workflow. And what you'll see is that that workflow has now reduced down to, let's say, 30 lines of code and a bit more succinct. And you can see that the iOS staging one is formatted in a similar way. And then I have one for a develop. And you can change things like who you're emailing when your builds are successful, or which branches you want to trigger your builds on, for example. Okay, so that's a way that you can use your aliases and anchors and mappings to make your YAML a little bit more efficient. Okay, so one of the final things I wanted to talk about is the idea of using YAML templates. So we've got customers who have started using YAML quite a lot, and they've decided that because they're in a kind of an agency environment where they're spinning up new projects all the time, a template would allow them to maintain some consistency and also some brevity within those configuration files. So they recommend to all of their developers that they take a template, and then it will have specific steps in it. And they can even take it another level by pre-populating values if they've got a project creation tool. Just a quick example of how this might look. Again, it will be using a definition section. They would have a section for who to send notifications for when they're running a debug build or a release build. Standard things for setting up the environment for the Android SDK. building for your debug release and your production release, running emulators. So just something that can be a consistent approach for each project that they start up. Okay, so I'm not going to say much more about YAML templates. So I'm going to come to a close in a moment, but before we do that, I just thought it would be fun if you wish us a happy birthday, because it is our second birthday today. So if you've got time, please go over to developertest.codemagic.app, and you'll find there a small 15-question quiz that you can take. And it's something that we made when Flutter Web was released as a preview technology. So we just built up a small app and we put it up onto the CodeMagic servers and host it there. You can answer the questions and then it should give you a developer character. I think I turned out to be Smarty, so if that's any use to anybody. I thought it was funny. So what I'd like you to do is, once you've run through the test, at the top right-hand corner of the screen, you should see a little tweet button. So just click on the button there and then do a mention to CodeMagic.io. I think it will automatically send a screenshot of your character as the embedded image, and then add a hashtag of Dartup, just to know that, just so we know you've been watching us here at this conference today. And then if you want to send an additional message, that would be really nice to hear from you as well. Okay, so thanks for your time today. I've been Kevin, and if you want to reach out to me on Twitter, then you can get hold of me on KevSuda.
Cool. Thank you very much, Kevin. And by the way, you opened my eyes, because like as this anchors and other capabilities of YAML, not every developer knows about them.
No, I mean, I was quite surprised as well, because as I said, I'd been using YAML for Docker and eJabberD, which is a chat platform, and I hadn't come across it. It was only when I started doing more with CodeMagic and using it for configuring the pipelines, one of our engineers sort of suggested, oh, maybe we can make this a bit more efficient and start using these things called anchors and aliases, and it's been very helpful. And we've got other customers who are starting to use it as well now as well. So I think it's helping them out.
Yeah, and I think that's why like development and tech and IT in general so interesting, because you think that you know everything. You know, this instrument is super simple. Come on, it's just a YAML, just like indentations, and that's it. But then, bam.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But actually, we have time for one short question, but it's a bit controversial.
Oh.
Yeah. So like sometimes YAML and other languages like this, when you have to like indent things, and sometimes some people, they arguing about that it's not really convenient, and languages like where you close something, braces or tags, they're way better. So what if you have like a magic wand, or I don't know, one wish? Will you replace YAML with, I don't know, XML or something like this, or that's good, that's fine for you?
I'm quite happy with it. I mean, what I would wish for is, if possible, I don't think it would be an automatic formatting for a YAML. Like you can get tools that automatically format your JSON documents. That would be really cool. So if there's anybody clever out there that could do that, that would solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, for sure.